My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 34 years old. And 3 days before my life split cleanly into a before and an after, I signed the papers that sold my startup for $9.3 million. On paper, it should have been the happiest moment of my life. It should have felt like vindication for every all-nighter, every investor rejection, every quiet panic attack I hid behind a polished pitch deck, every holiday I skipped, every relationship I neglected, and every year I spent betting on myself while people around me wondered when I was finally going to get serious and choose a safer life. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something colder. I sat at my kitchen island staring at my phone while congratulations rolled in from people who had barely checked on me during the years I was drowning in stress. The messages sounded warm, but I knew the rhythm too well. Celebration in my family had a way of turning into expectation. Good news never stayed mine for long. It became communal property, then leverage, then obligation dressed up as love. Even before anyone had the full details, requests started arriving in soft, careful language. One message hinted at a short-term cash issue. Another mentioned a delayed payment that had suddenly become urgent. Someone floated the idea that maybe now was the perfect time to help the family finally breathe. I didn't even have to open all of them to know where they were headed. That was when my husband looked at me from across the room with a calm expression I didn't fully understand until later. He didn't congratulate me again. He didn't ask what I wanted to buy or where we should travel. He said, "Call them and tell them you lost everything." I laughed at first because the idea sounded brutal, almost theatrical. But he didn't smile. He said, "Let's see who they are when there's no money left to chase." And because some hidden part of me was tired of pretending not to notice what had always been true, I listened. That night, I picked up my phone and stepped into a lie so simple it should have collapsed immediately. Instead, it exposed years of truth in less than a week. Within days, the people I had spent most of my adult life rescuing showed me exactly what I had really meant to them. Not a daughter, not a sister, not someone to love when life got hard. Just the person they trusted to make hard things disappear with a wire transfer and a guilty conscience. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like there? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The first person I called was my sister. I didn't say her name out loud at first because even then, some reflex inside me still wanted to protect her from the worst version of herself. That's the strange thing about family conditioning. Even when you know what someone is capable of, some part of you keeps editing reality to preserve the image you wish were true. I stood by the glass door leading to the patio, phone in hand, looking at my own reflection for a second before I dialed. When she answered, her voice was light, upbeat, unguarded. She sounded like someone expecting pleasant news, maybe even profitable news. I told her I needed to talk, and that it was serious. Her tone shifted instantly, and for one brief second I heard what I had wanted to hear all along. Concern. Real concern, or at least a good imitation of it. I told her the deal had fallen apart in the final stages, that what I thought would secure my future had turned into a disaster, that after taxes, penalties, legal fallout, and cleanup costs, there was nothing left worth naming. I let silence sit there after I said it. I wanted to give her room to step toward me, to ask if I was okay, to ask if she should come over, to ask anything that suggested I existed as a person in that moment, not as a financial category. She gasped. She said, "Oh my God, Olivia, are you serious?" Then came the pause. A long, quiet pause that would have sounded compassionate to anyone who didn't know her, but I knew that pause. It meant she was recalculating. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way so subtle that, years earlier, I would have ignored it. She asked what this meant for the help I had promised to talk about. Not help for me, help from me. I didn't answer, so she filled the silence the way entitled people often do when they sense resistance. She started explaining how stressful things had been on her side. The school payments were due. Her husband's hours had been cut. The cost of the renovation had gone way beyond what they expected. She said she had been counting on my sale finally giving everyone some breathing room. Everyone, not me, everyone. Then she reminded me of all the times I had always come through, as if my past generosity had created a permanent debt I owed to the family forever. I could feel the old guilt trying to rise in me out of sheer muscle memory, but something was different this time. Maybe because I knew it was a test. Maybe because hearing her react to my ruin by reviewing her own needs made the pattern impossible to excuse. I told her I had nothing left. She went quiet again, but now there was frustration under the silence. Then she said, "You can't be completely broke. There has to be something. You're too smart to lose all of it." It sounded flattering on the surface, but it wasn't faith in me. It was resistance to inconvenience. She didn't want me to be okay. She wanted me to still be useful. When I repeated that I had nothing left to give, her sympathy collapsed almost instantly. She told me I should have been more careful. She told me this was terrible timing because people had already made plans. People, plans, around money that had never belonged to them. By the end of that call, something in me stopped reaching for excuses. I realized I had spent years confusing proximity with loyalty, history with love, and dependency with emotional connection. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but it rewrote decades of my understanding in real time. The next morning, I called my parents together. My husband sat across from me at the dining table with a mug in his hands, watching me in that steady, irritatingly clear way that made me feel both protected and exposed. I didn't want him to be right about my family, because if he was right, then it meant I had built my entire emotional life around a lie I had helped maintain. I dialed anyway. My mother answered first, warm and familiar, using the exact tone that had comforted me since childhood. She asked if I had slept, whether I was taking care of myself, whether I had finally stopped working long enough to breathe after the sale. A second later, my father joined the call. His voice was measured, practical, controlled. Even now, decades into adulthood, that voice could still make part of me feel 12 years old. I told them what I had rehearsed. I said the deal had collapsed in a way I hadn't seen coming. I said the cleanup had gutted me. I said I had been too embarrassed to tell anyone until now. But there was no money. The $9.3 million they had heard about might as well have never existed. For a few seconds after I said it, no one spoke. My mother exhaled like I had punched the air out of her lungs. My father asked what exactly happened. He sounded sharp, but not yet selfish. My mother asked whether I was safe, whether there were legal problems, whether anyone was coming after me. I almost hated how quickly that tiny bit of concern loosened something in my chest. It made me realize how little care I had trained myself to expect. Then came the shift. Not abrupt enough to sound evil, just smooth enough to be familiar. My father asked what this meant for the property taxes I had said I could probably help with after the sale. My mother mentioned medical bills she had assumed I would cover once things settled. Then my father revealed, in the same tone someone might use to discuss weather, that they had already structured certain decisions around my expected support. He had co-signed part of a renovation loan connected to my sister's family because he assumed I would step in if payments got tight. My mother had reassured relatives that the family would be fine because I was finally in a position to carry everyone over the rough patch. I asked them, slowly, why they would commit to other people using money that was never theirs. My father sounded offended by the question itself. He said that's what families do when they trust each other. He said I had always talked about wanting security for everyone. He said my success had opened doors for the whole family, whether I liked it or not. That sentence landed harder than the rest because it stripped away the performance. I could suddenly see the pattern across my life with painful clarity. The day I won a scholarship and my father told relatives, half joking and half proud, that I was the family's retirement plan. The time I got my first real bonus and my mother, eyes glistening, said how relieved she was that life might finally get easier for all of us. The countless moments where I was praised for being generous, mature, dependable, grounded, only to realize years later that every compliment had a function. I had not been loved for who I was. I had been rewarded for how useful I was willing to be. When I said I couldn't help them, not now, not later, not with anything, their concern changed shape. My mother's voice thinned with panic. She said, "But we already told people." My father said, "You can't drop this on us after everyone has planned around you." Planned around me. Like I was infrastructure. Like I was income. Like I was not a person who might get tired, change, or collapse. I waited for one of them to circle back and ask how I was holding up, whether I needed anything, whether I wanted company, whether I was ashamed or scared or numb. It never came. Instead, they began discussing timing, obligations, reputation, and what alternatives might exist if I truly could no longer provide what they had expected. I hung up feeling colder than I had after the call with my sister, because something about hearing it from my parents confirmed that this had never been one person's flaw. It was a family design. My husband let the silence sit for a while before asking quietly, "Do you still think this is love?" I looked at the table, at my own hands, at the life I had built while dragging everyone else behind me, and for the first time I answered honestly, "I think it's control with better manners." 2 days later, they asked to meet in person. That alone told me more than they intended, because no one had urgently needed to see me when they thought I was successful. No one had insisted on dinner when the deal first closed. No one had shown up with flowers or pride or curiosity about what it had taken to build the company in the first place. But now that they believed the money was gone, suddenly, they needed a family conversation face to face. I agreed, but I set the meeting at my house. Not a cafe where concern could be performed in public. Not a restaurant where everyone could hide behind menus and small talk. My house. The one whose down payment I had made on my own. The one where I had hosted their birthdays, their holiday dinners, their crisis talks, their recovery weeks, and all the gatherings where I played successful daughter, stable sister, reliable provider. Before they arrived, I printed 6 years of financial records. Every transfer, every check, every tuition payment, every emergency loan, every car repair, every insurance rescue, every mortgage gap, every medical bill I quietly covered, every temporary favor that became permanent the moment I said yes. I spread them across the dining table first, then gathered them into folders. I ran the total again because I thought I had made a mistake the first time. I hadn't. The number was staggering, but the total wasn't even the part that hit me hardest. It was the frequency, the rhythm of extraction. I had barely gone a few months and years without someone needing something urgent from me. Their dependency wasn't random. It was built into the structure of our relationships. When they arrived, my husband opened the door and let them in without ceremony. My mother came in first looking fragile, as if she had rehearsed sorrow on the drive over. My father looked impatient, ready to control the conversation. My sister looked tense in the way people do when they are both anxious and secretly convinced they can still steer the outcome. We sat in the living room. No drinks, no snacks, no softening. I asked them directly what they expected from me if I truly had lost everything. My mother said family should come together in hard times. My father said everyone would need to adjust, but we had to think practically. My sister said, in a voice that tried to sound reasonable, that I still had more earning power than the rest of them and would probably recover faster. So the smart thing was to keep contributing where I could. I remember looking at her and feeling not outrage at first, but a deep, weary clarity. Even in my supposed collapse, I was still being cast as the most available solution. I asked whether any of them had considered helping me. A place to breathe, time to recover, emotional support without an invoice hidden inside it. My sister blinked like she didn't understand the question. My father said emotional support mattered, of course, but money problems were real. My mother began crying, but every sentence she spoke while crying still somehow returned to bills, commitments, appearances, and relatives who had been told not to worry because I would handle things. That was when I placed the folders on the table. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at. Then my father opened the first one and saw page after page of dated records, transfer after transfer, year after year, memo lines spelling out the story they always wanted me to forget. Dental emergency, tuition shortfall, home repair, credit card catch-up, business setback, lease rescue, holiday overdraft, quiet support, family need. My mother stopped crying long enough to stare. My sister's face changed first, tightening with anger before embarrassment could fully land. My father tried to reclaim the ground by saying families don't keep score. I told him I hadn't kept score when I believed I was loved freely. I started keeping records when I realized love in this family was only easiest to access when I was funding it. My voice stayed calm, which unsettled them more than yelling would have. I told them the papers were not there to shame them. They were there to stop the oldest trick in our family, the one where history gets rewritten the second I say no. For the first time in years, every dollar was visible, every rescue named, every burden placed back in the light where no one could call it generosity, flowing naturally through a happy family. The room changed after that. Not because anyone understood, but because the evidence had made denial more expensive. What followed was not a conversation. It was a collapse. My sister was the first to turn openly aggressive. She shoved the folder away like it disgusted her, and said only a bitter person weaponized past help to justify abandoning family. She said I was humiliating everyone to avoid responsibility. My father stepped in right after her, using that steady, reasonable tone that had always made him sound right to people who didn't know him closely. He said the records proved nothing except that I had been fortunate enough to help, and that keeping documentation of family support was cold, transactional, and disrespectful. That word, transactional, almost made me laugh because it had defined every major interaction we'd had for years. I asked him what exactly he thought our relationship had been, if not transactional. Was it emotional support when he mocked my first business and called it a glorified side project? Was it support when he told relatives my husband should prepare for instability because women like me chased ego instead of security? Was it support when my mother asked me to leave my own recovery bed after surgery because my sister needed help with childcare more urgently than I needed rest? Every question I asked stripped another layer off the performance. My mother tried to regain control by crying harder. She said I was exhausted, hurt, not thinking clearly. She said money had changed me. My sister snapped that my husband had filled my head with poison and turned me against the people who had always been there. My husband, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made what he said land even harder. He said no one had turned me against them. He had simply watched the pattern more clearly than I had because he loved me without needing something from me. He said he had seen how every success became family property, how every holiday turned into a funding discussion, how every boundary I tried to set was treated like cruelty. My father stood up so abruptly the coffee table shook. He pointed at my husband and said, "Outsiders do not get to define family." My husband met his eyes and answered, "Then family should have acted like family before I had to say anything." The silence after that was sharp enough to cut. My sister switched tactics immediately. She started crying, then pleading, then accusing. She said I was choosing a man over blood. She said people online loved talking about boundaries because they didn't understand real family. She said I was cruel for punishing everyone during a difficult time. I asked her one question. If I had actually lost everything, if I had called asking to move in, broke and exhausted and unable to help anybody, would she have taken me in without resentment? She didn't answer. Her face told me everything before her silence did. So I answered for her. I said she wouldn't have seen a sister in crisis. She would have seen a problem with no return on investment. That landed hard. My mother looked stunned. My father looked furious. My sister looked exposed. And that was the exact moment I told them the truth. I told them the sale had gone through. I told them the money was real. I told them I had not lost everything. I had lied because I needed to know whether love in this family could survive the removal of financial access. No one moved. No one breathed. My mother looked like she might faint. My father's expression changed twice in 2 seconds. First outrage, then calculation. My sister stared at me like the floor had disappeared under her. I told them this had not been a prank. It had been a test, and they had failed it almost immediately. I said I needed to know who would still see me as human when I had nothing convenient to offer. I needed to know whether the daughter they praised and the sister they leaned on actually existed apart from my usefulness. Now I knew. My father called the test manipulative. My mother said I had gone too far. My sister demanded to know how I could do something so cruel to people who loved me. That was when I said the lie was not the cruelest part. The cruelest part was how quickly they turned my imagined ruin into an inconvenience to themselves. I told them there would be no more automatic rescues, no more emergency payments, no more soft pressure disguised as family duty. I told them the standing help ended now. Every monthly transfer, every quiet cushion, every backup plan they had built around my labor and my money. Done. That was when panic broke through their anger. They all began speaking at once, but panic sounds different from concern. It is rawer, less polished, more revealing. And in those chaotic minutes, I heard the truth more clearly than I ever had in the years before. They did not leave with grace because grace belongs to people capable of reflection, and reflection was the one thing none of them seemed willing to risk. Instead, they cycled through every tactic that had kept me in place for years. My mother cried so hard her whole body shook and said stress like this would destroy her health. My father tried authority, telling me no decent daughter disgraced her family over hurt feelings and misunderstandings. My sister went lower than either of them. She said she hoped my money kept me warm when I had nobody left. She said success had made me arrogant, hard, and selfish. Then she made the mistake that killed whatever softness was still alive in me. She brought up her children. She said if I stopped helping, their lives would suffer, and if they lost stability, that blood would be on my hands. She used her own children like leverage, like emotional collateral in a negotiation she still thought she could win. Old me would have folded right there. Old me would have rushed to separate innocent children from adult consequences and ended up paying the bill anyway. But once the structure becomes visible, you cannot unsee it. I told her her children were not hostages, and I would not allow her to use motherhood as a shield for entitlement. I told my parents their panic had nothing to do with losing me emotionally. It had everything to do with losing access to the person who made their choices less costly. I told all three of them that I had spent years confusing guilt with loyalty, rescuing with love, usefulness with identity. That ended today. My husband walked to the front door and opened it. The gesture was small, almost polite, but it changed the room completely. An exit, a limit, a physical refusal to let the old cycle continue. My father looked at that open door and understood, maybe for the first time, that this was not one more emotional scene he could wait out until I softened. It was structural, final unless something fundamental changed. He made one last attempt to regain control. He said, if I wanted distance, fine, but family assets and obligations would have to be reviewed because things were more complicated than I understood. He thought legal language would scare me back into obedience. It didn't. I reminded him that many of the assets they were worried about had only remained stable because of money I provided. The property under renovation. The tax issue I had quietly covered twice before. The debt cycles hidden inside polite phrases like shortfall and bridge period. I told him if he wanted to discuss paper, liability, and records, I was fully prepared. My financial team had already begun reviewing every written agreement, every transfer labeled as temporary, every obligation I had been pressured into supporting. That was the first moment real fear crossed his face without disguise. My sister went pale. My mother stopped crying long enough to look at him for rescue, but he had none ready. They left in a storm of anger, accusation, and wounded pride, but under all of it was terror. Real terror. And once they were gone, I didn't chase them, didn't second-guess myself, didn't text anyone to soften what had happened. Over the next week, I did what years of fear had kept me from doing. I canceled every standing transfer. I removed myself from two shared obligations my father had insisted were temporary formalities. I changed account access, updated my estate documents, notified them in writing that future financial requests would not receive responses, and documented everything. I also got ahead of the family narrative. Before they could tell relatives I had become unstable or cruel, I calmly told extended family that I was taking distance because repeated financial boundary violations had made the relationship unhealthy. Predictably, the backlash came. I was called cold, manipulated by my husband, corrupted by money, too proud, too harsh, too Western, too sensitive. But insults have less power when they are no longer attached to access. And soon enough, reality started arriving for them in ways accusations could not stop. The second property renovation stalled. Contractors stopped showing up when deposits failed. The tax issue my father kept minimizing became urgent. My sister's household, which had floated for years on confidence and assumptions, started cracking at the seams. Within 10 days, she texted twice, then 6 times, then started calling from numbers I didn't recognize. I let every call ring out. For the first time in my adult life, somebody else's emergency was not automatically assigned to me. That silence felt unfamiliar at first, then sacred. 3 weeks after I cut them off, I learned what happens when an entire family system has been built around one person's willingness to absorb shock. Once the buffer disappears, hidden weaknesses stop hiding. The debts do not vanish. The panic does not stay private. And the people who once spoke with confidence suddenly have to face the full weight of the choices they made while assuming someone else would carry the consequences. My sister's husband had taken on more debt than they could realistically manage because they assumed my post-sale money would eventually help consolidate it, soften it, or erase the worst of it before anyone had to pay the real price. Without that safety net, they missed 2 payments tied to the renovation project they had expanded too aggressively. A lender froze disbursements. The contractor filed notice. Their polished, curated life started fraying in public. Her social media, once full of filtered kitchen samples, smiling school photos, inspirational captions about family loyalty, and carefully staged domestic calm, went quiet almost overnight. Even the silence felt revealing, like the performance had finally run out of lighting. My father called me twice from blocked numbers. I let both go to voicemail and deleted them without listening. Then an aunt I barely spoke to reached out to check in, which in my family usually meant someone had sent a scout to test whether I was softening. I stayed polite, gave nothing away, and ended the call before concern could turn into persuasion. My mother eventually sent a long message late at night. She said she had not been sleeping. She said the house felt heavy, like every room carried tension. She admitted, in the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her in years, that she had told people things out of pride and now didn't know how to explain why plans were unraveling. She said relatives were starting to ask questions. She said people who had once praised the family's good fortune were now whispering, and she could feel the embarrassment settling over everything like dust. For a moment, reading it, I felt the old ache move in my chest. Not guilt, exactly. More like grief for the version of a mother I had always wanted to have, the kind who would have reached out not because the walls were closing in, but because her daughter might be hurting too, the kind who would have chosen honesty before humiliation forced it out of her. But even that message, once I read it twice, bent back toward the same old pattern. It ended with a soft request disguised as vulnerability. She wrote that if I could just help them through this one unstable season, everyone could calm down and rebuild. Rebuild what? I wondered. Trust? Accountability? Or the old arrangement where my exhaustion financed their comfort and my silence preserved their self-image? Rebuild the same house of expectations, only with nicer words and shakier voices? I didn't answer. Instead, I kept building something else with the energy I used to spend on damage control. I began meeting founders again, but this time not as a woman begging for belief. I came back as an investor. I joined a women's founder network, mentored 2 early-stage entrepreneurs, and funded scholarships for founders from low-income families because I wanted my money to create independence, not deepen manipulation. I wanted it to open doors, not keep me trapped in old rooms. My husband and I took a weekend trip without me spending half the time fielding family emergencies disguised as love. I slept better. I laughed more. I started noticing how calm a house can feel when no one is reaching into it with demands. Peace did not arrive like a dramatic revelation. It came quietly, in small permissions. Coffee that stayed hot because no crisis interrupted breakfast. Evenings without dread when my phone lit up. The strange relief of realizing I could be generous without being available for exploitation. The even stranger relief of knowing I no longer had to earn affection by solving problems no one should have handed me in the first place. Then came the message that would once have pulled me straight back into the cycle. It was from my sister. Not a casual text. A paragraph long enough to suggest collapse, short enough to avoid full accountability. Attached was a photo of my parents sitting at their dining table surrounded by papers. They looked older than I had ever seen them. Smaller, too. My father's shoulders were bent. My mother's face looked worn in a way that made me pause. The papers were spread everywhere, and even through the screen I could tell this was no longer theater. Something real had cracked. The caption read, "This has gone too far. Dad may have to sell the property. Mom is falling apart. I know we were wrong. Please meet me. No demands. No lies. Just once." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because guilt had taken over the way it once would have, but because I was finally seeing the pattern from outside it. For years, my role had been simple. Rescue first, feel later, solve first, grieve later. Transfer the money, smooth the conflict, carry the burden, then tell myself that love was supposed to feel expensive. Now their crisis was real. Their consequences were real. Their fear was real. Maybe even their regret was real. But regret is not repair. Panic is not transformation. Consequences can humble people, but they can also just make them desperate. Desperation can look a lot like sincerity when you are the one they need something from. I had learned that lesson too well to ignore it now. I set the phone down and looked across the room at my husband. He didn't tell me what to do. He never had. That, more than anything, was how I learned the difference between love and control. Control corners you, pressures you, and calls it loyalty. Love gives you space to see clearly and decide freely. Love does not rush into the room carrying shame, debt, and emotional blackmail, then ask you to confuse surrender with compassion. I still haven't decided whether I'll meet her. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But this much I know with absolute certainty. If I ever sit across from my family again, it will not be as the daughter who pays to keep peace alive. It will not be as the sister who mistakes sacrifice for connection. It will not be as the woman they trained to feel guilty every time she chose herself. If I meet them again, it will be as the woman who finally learned that being needed is not the same as being loved. And once that lesson hardens into truth, you stop handing out pieces of yourself just because someone shares your blood. At Revenge Mangan, our team is dedicated to creating meaningful and engaging stories for our audience. We want to make it clear that every story on this channel is purely fictional, created to share helpful life lessons and educational values with viewers. This story highlights the importance of setting healthy boundaries and recognizing the difference between genuine love and unhealthy dependence. It offers educational value by encouraging viewers to reflect on trust, self-respect, and the wisdom that comes from difficult life experiences.